Hi guys, thanks for coming out to see my talk. So my talk's about game design and creativity as practical skills. So hopefully I'll break down what that means and how we can better practice creativity and game designer skills. So are there any game designers in the audience? Or people who work within game development? Okay, there's a few, that's great. Well, I'm hoping that this talk will be applicable to anyone who works within a creative technology field. It is a little bit game focused, but hopefully there's something you can use in there. So I work at Sumo Digital. Sumo Digital is a company that's based in the UK. We work with a lot of different partners and a lot of different IPs across a whole range of different platforms. So we have a whole bunch of different studios. Our main studio is in Sheffield in the UK. We have a couple of other studios in the UK, and we also have one in India. And I think there's about 500 people, or more than 500 people worldwide. So who am I? Well, I'm Joe. I studied game design a while back at the University of Suffolk, which is a fantastic uni in the UK. And then I moved over to Gorilla Cambridge to work on Killzone Mercenary, and then moved over to their sister studio to work on Horizon Zero Dawn as a game designer, working on all of their traversal mechanics. And then I moved back to the UK to work on Star Citizen Squadron 42, so that's the single-player campaign, and then moved on to the online component of it. And a year ago, I moved over to Sumo Digital, where we've just released Hitman 2 in partnership as co-developers with IO Interactive. So what is a game design? What is game design? So this is the slide that I've looked at the most when making this slideshow. Honestly, it's one of those things that I've gone back and forth and go, well, that's not really what I do, this is kind of what I do. But basically it boils down to handling the perception and interaction with the user experience. And it's sort of somewhere between a creative and a technical role. It kind of varies from where you are, what type of designer you want to be. So my mantra as a game designer, as you might have guessed from the talk name, I think that creativity and game design are very, very practical skills. Obviously, being creative as a game designer is your job, so you need to be able to do it on demand. So you need to work out a way of being able to practice that. And it's also a common misconception that game design is just coming up with the ideas, but it's actually the whole process, taking it from beginning to end. And a lot of creativity, I feel, as well, is actually about creating and solving problems and coming up with creative solutions. So what does creativity as a skill mean? So I want to talk a little bit in this talk about how creativity as a skill can actually be practiced, and how we can use research and reference to find sources to draw from, and then use limitations to actually boost those experiences, and then through constant iteration and testing, you really refine those experiences. So research and reference. So I'm a big believer that actually creativity is a culmination of all of our experiences and our ideas. So really like what we should be doing as a game designer or as a creative person is drawing on as many references as we can, and we can use those to inspire new ideas. And obviously we can also use them to figure out what the expectations are, what the conventions are. So as a game designer, obviously the obvious reference is really playing games, and this is so important, is actually to go out, play the stuff that's on the market, play the really obscure stuff, play the really big stuff, and just get a feel for what's good, what's bad, why is it that way, what kind of things can you do to break those conventions. And I actually also think that now in our industry, film and television, that's also quite obvious research. It's something that we draw a lot of parallels to. And again, it's super useful, and I think we should definitely do that. But beyond that, I found this great quote from a GDC talk from Sid Meier, and he talks about the industry being too self-referential. I actually think that that also applies to the type of things that we're referencing. So not just looking inward, but also looking at the same things as an industry. So a way that we can combat that is actually starting to look a little bit wider and looking beyond our own creative mediums and looking to things like architecture or art and seeing how maybe they can inspire us. So instead of us sort of seeing what is the art style that generally this genre uses, well, maybe we can actually inspire something artistically from an art piece or architecture, or maybe instead of looking at what the standards of a genre are, we can actually look at a sport and see how those rules could influence our game. Do you guys know Monument Valley? It's a pretty fantastic game. It's based in that really abstract architecture from MC Escher. And what I really love about this game is that they've not inspired their aesthetic from MC Escher. They've really inspired their mechanics. They've looked beyond just sort of taking what's already been done and putting it there, and they've sort of said, okay, how would this apply if this was a puzzle? How would this work in a game? And I think that's a really important step for us as designers to take, is to think about how it could inspire our mechanics. So this is a game, Ruya, from a good friend of mine, and he actually put a quote online, which is, "Music is also one of the biggest tools for generating ideas. I listen to a song and try to recreate the feelings that it elicits in me." So what I love about this is that he's looking at a piece and sitting there and digesting it and going, how does this make me feel? And then using our own medium to try and recreate that feeling. So instead of you just taking this thing over here and putting it in your own medium, you're actually trying to recreate those feelings. And I think this is a really powerful tool. So this is just a random picture that I found when I was making the talk. But actually, what I really love about this is that beyond media, this kind of imagery, something in nature, can really bring to life loads of new game design ideas. So there's a pretty famous story about in The Last of Us, the enemy design was inspired through a BBC Nature documentary with some fungus or parasite or something, and that's how they came up with the idea of the clickers. And I think that's really interesting that they've looked completely outside of media and said, okay, where can we draw inspiration from? And for me, I look at this image and I just sort of think, okay, well, what would happen if you were down at this size, or what would happen if this guy was an enemy, or if this was a jump pad? And I think that's really important, is to just look outside of media, see what else there is that you can draw inspiration from. And maybe you'd end up with Mario if you ended up setting a world within a mushroom kingdom. So once you've taken on board and you've researched and you've looked at all of these different things, it's important to take it to the next step and start to research the subject. Like, how did those designers come to that conclusion? Why is the science behind that the way that it is? And just consider how that could then affect your game designs. So what you can actually do is you can take that theory and then apply it to your own game design. So in one of the Mario games, famously, they actually used a structure of Japanese poetry to inspire their level design. So they introduced an idea, developed it, turned it on its head, and then basically finished it off, like brought everything together and then threw it away, and that's how all of their levels progress. Disneyland famously has like a very specific set of rules of like how you move around the space and how it feels to be there and how you know where you are, and maybe there's something within level design that we can learn from that. And the same way that we draw upon affordances and stuff from the design of everyday things, you know, how do we know a cup is supposed to be picked up because of its handle? Definitely there's something there that can teach us about UX design. So once you've got your reference, it's super important not to just take that reference and just remake it. What you really want to do is you want to put it through your own filter, apply your own flavor and make it your own. And a really great way of doing that is to abstract it and to change it and combine it with other references, and then, you know, bring it all together and think about, like, how did that make me feel? How did that piece achieve what it wanted to achieve? And then try to do that with your work. Excuse me. So our experiences can act as a palette for creativity. I've seen some variation of this quote hundreds of times on the internet. I'm not really sure where it comes from, but I really like it because I tend to agree. So this is the idea that everything we know kind of comes together to create our creative output. So leading on from that, what we really should be doing as designers is actually going out and experiencing things. So Recently, I've been working on a castle level, so obviously go out, experience castles. You know, how does it feel to touch? How does it smell? How does it feel to be here? Like, what does it feel like to be stood in front of it and get that imposing feeling? And the same when I was working on the climbing mechanics in Horizon. I didn't know anything about climbing, so the next best thing I could do was go out and experience it. You know, it's, oh, actually, this is really difficult. How can we pull this into our game designs? And I think it really gives us a deeper understanding of how something should be and how something should feel to play. And also, we get all of these extra sensory feelings and of information that just we wouldn't get without going and looking and feeling and being there. So then you can feed that back into your designs. And once you've got it as well, it's so important to then share it with your team, digest it together. I mean, maybe your teammate, their experience is very different to yours, so their filter actually interprets it in a very different way. So you can discuss it all together. So something that's quite unique to Sumo Digital, I think, is that we actually work with a lot of other people's IPs. So obviously, with that, we have to do so much research and reference into, okay, like, what are the fan expectations here, and what can we learn from what's already been done, and that will help us direct where we want to go. And obviously, what's great about working with the IP holders is actually we can talk to them and we can learn, like, hey, how did you guys make this? Like, what can we learn from you? And that's really great. So yeah, recently on Hitman, we were working with IO, and those guys, they know Hitman so well, so we had so much to learn from them, just talking and just listening to what they were doing. And also we spent so much time just playing the game and just working out, like, what makes a Hitman level tick. So how can we inspire creativity through reference? Well, I guess the biggest takeaway is just to go out and experience as much different type of reference as you can, whether that's first-hand or third-hand. Just acquire it and, you know, really digest it, trying to work out what makes it tick, abstract those references, combine them, and see what happens when you put them through your filter or your teammates' filter. And yeah, try to inspire, try to evoke the same emotions as the piece that you're referencing evokes, instead of just copying it outright. So the next tool you have in your belt is limitations. So limitations kind of sounds like a bad thing, but actually I think that it can be a really good thing for creativity. So a big part of creativity, I feel, is actually problem solving and working out, okay, well, this is our problem, how do we solve this? So limitations, they actually define that problem space for us. They say, well, you've got to work within here, and obviously as designers we know that rules are meant to be broken, so we're like, well, okay, maybe over here, and push it a little bit over here. So I just want to talk a little bit more about limitations. So obviously we have enforced limitations with every project, I'm sure, across all disciplines. That's our budget, our time, our technical ability, our artistic ability, and they really do create the main problem space to work within. And if we can make sure that we understand what the limitations are there, then we can start to push it. I mean, historically, like, we've seen a lot of games that have really utilized their technical limitations to come up with really innovative solutions. So in the original Silent Hill game, obviously the draw distance on the PlayStation 1 wasn't as great as we have now on modern hardware. So they've actually fed that into the game design. So, well, actually, what if that was a feature there, and you end up with something that's quite ominous, and walking around you don't really know what's coming next, which really supports the core aesthetic of the game. So before I move on, I just want to talk a little bit about functional fixedness. So functional fixedness is a cognitive bias that basically limits us to using an object in a traditional means. So it's the idea that we can't sort of see past what the traditional use of an object was. So there was a whole bunch of tests that have just been redone and redone and redone, called the candle problem. And what this is participants were given a box of tacks, a candle, and a box of matches, and said, affix the candle to the wall so that the wax doesn't drip on the onto the floor. And you get all of these participants, and they're trying to tack the candle to the wall, and you see these ones who are melting the wax to try and create an adhesive, which is, I mean, it's a very creative solution, but really the solution is tip the tacks out of the box and tack the box to the wall, and then you sit the candle in that. But because of the way that the problem was presented, people weren't able to see past the first solutions they were coming up with. So then they retested, and you say, okay, like, well, we're gonna phrase the question differently, or we're gonna present the problem with the tax outside of the box. And what you started to see was people were just immediately getting it, and it really shows us that actually the way that a problem is presented can help us change the way that we solve it. So limitations basically can redefine that problem space. And what I mean by there is basically we're presenting the problem in a slightly different way, or moving where the problem is. So thinking about that, basically what we can actually do is we can start to apply our own limitations to a project, and these can be used to like really create like outside of the box thinking and create even new problem spaces that you didn't have before, but that will require you to come up with interesting or creative solutions. So in The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, which is a fantastic game, obviously, you know, you can swim across a lake and it's fine, you know, but then there's this I wonder if the designers maybe sort of stood back and thought, well, how else could we get across this? Or maybe we could fly, or maybe we could cut down a log, or maybe we could shoot ourselves across the river. So actually taking something that you're quite happy with in your project, saying, oh yeah, no, we've got swimming. It's like, well, what happened if we said that you can't swim anymore? Like, what would be the solution to getting across that river then? And I think that's something that we should really try to do, even with the things that we're happy with in our projects. So a type of limitation that we can apply to a project is something that I'm calling a paradoxical limitation. And this is the idea that you've got two things that don't really sound like they go together. And actually applying this restriction can create some really interesting problem spaces that will likely have some interesting solutions. So these are two of my favorite games, Ico and Journey. And both of these games, they really require like an emotional, meaningful bonds to be created either between two characters or two players. And there's this weird paradoxical limitation, and they said, well, do you know what? No dialogue, or no vocal connection. Obviously, in Ico, they speak different languages, and in Journey, you have no voice at all. So then you start to think, oh, well, maybe they had to come up with these really interesting ways for them to communicate. So maybe they have to grab their hand, or maybe in Journey, you actually make music towards each other and sort of dance around trying to get the other player to follow you. And it ends up with a really interesting and unique way of creating that emotional bond, whereas a lot of games, they tend to just have the dialogue played at you. So creating these kind of limitations can be a really interesting way to drum up new problems and come up with interesting solutions. So who knows what games jams are? They're basically just hackathons for video games. So it tends to be, you know, a short time frame, maybe 48 hours, often set against a theme. And the idea is that, you know, you've got this really tight condensed time period, and you want to make a game in that period. So these are a bunch of games that I've made in games jams, and you probably see that one of my enforced limitations is that I'm not very good at making anything other than cubes. So that's something that I have to work within those constraints and see how far I can push it. But I think they're a really interesting way just to kind of force you to step outside of your comfort zone and start to coming up with these really creative solutions to, well, in a long development, we would do this, this, and this, but in this really short development, we don't have time for that, so we have to really be clever in the way that we work. And these can actually be applied to larger companies. Like, don't just think that these are just for you to do on your own. Like, you can actually apply these to bigger teams. So at Sumo Digital, one of the games that we published internally is Snake Pass. And that actually came from one of our biannual games jams, where we get everyone all together and we say, okay, like, you've got 2 weeks, let's make a game. And you can work on your own or in teams. And the designer who came up with this really interesting idea that also has this limitation of, well, it's a 3D platformer, but you can't jump. And usually you'd go, hang on, that doesn't sound right. All platformers, they have jumping, that's what they're about, but it actually forces them to think in this really interesting way of like, oh, well, how would you move around? So another limitation that's quite bespoke to Sumo is, again, working with established IPs. Obviously, we've kind of got this established coherent world that already exists, so you have to kind of work out how to slot within that, and you've got all of these player expectations that you need to work with. But what's really interesting is once you've got all of those player expectations, you can actually start to push them and see, okay, well, how far can we push this to create something new? And it's a really great tool to work with. So why do we use limitations? So basically, limitations They can obviously help us scope a project properly. If we're aware of them, then we know, okay, this is what we've got to deal with. This is our budget, this is our resources, this is our time. So obviously it's that. But it can actually also be a really useful tool in framing, okay, well, we've got this problem, but what if this wasn't a problem? What if we made this the problem? And then maybe that's got all of these interesting solutions that come out of that. So how do we embrace limitations as a creative tool? Well, basically, we just need to stop thinking of limitations to a project as a problem and start thinking of them as a positive thing. Like, think about what they can give us and consider that, well, a limitation at its core is just a problem, and a problem usually has a solution. What that solution is, that's for you creatives to find out, right? So once we're aware of that, we can actually then start to apply our own limitations to a project. So maybe we want to limit our color palette or our file size or the types of mechanics that we want to use. And then hopefully we'll come up with something unique. So finally, I want to talk about iteration and testing. So obviously, the other part of game design on top of coming up with ideas is actually just making things. So rapid iteration is basically the idea that you just quickly turn around ideas. So you create something, you test it, you evaluate it, and then you make changes. You make very, very rapid changes. I'm a big believer that actually it's really important to get out of the paper stage of a project and get into the development stage as soon as possible, because it's all well and good us saying, well, I think it's going to feel this way, but until you've got the controller in your hands, it's very difficult to know exactly how it's going to feel. So getting it out of paper early is great. And when we're iterating, it's also important to consider the context and why we're iterating. So obviously we can make changes just randomly, but at a certain point we really need to focus ourselves and think about, okay, so why are we making these changes, and what feedback is this based on? And also it is fun to experiment with ideas that you're happy with. Going back to the river idea, like, yeah, okay, we can swim across the river, but actually, like, what happens if we change that? Like, what happens if we change our method of approaching this? So when we're iterating, obviously if you're iterating that quickly, you're probably going to come up with some dud ideas. That's fine. It's really important to kind of embrace those mistakes, learn from them, and realize, okay, why did this happen? And then feed that into your next iterations. And to be honest, like, when you're in the early stages of development, it's fine to be bold, do some crazy ideas, and if they don't work, just get rid of them. It's fine. And that's really the beauty of rapid iteration, is that you're making something, there's very little risk associated with it, because you've maybe only spent a day or a couple of days on it, so you can just throw it out if it's not working. But then you still take what you've learned from that and put it into your next designs. So testing in context. So obviously when we're making a feature, it's easy to kind of get bogged down on, okay, this is my feature and that everything about this is mine, but you have to remember that like, actually it should be developed in the context of the whole game. So how does it interact with this system over here, and what happens if we pull on this system over here? Does that maybe change this thing? So it's really important when you're sitting at your desk, okay, you know, maybe you are testing it alone, but actually you want to start to pull in all of these other things and then test it in the context of the whole game. And then once we do that, like, we'll have a more holistic view of how things are supposed to work as like together. So after we've obviously tested it ourselves and we've started to, you know, get a good feel for how it's working, we need to, as soon as possible, just give it to the hands of people who aren't involved with the development. Surprisingly, developers, they will be the best at your game, because obviously they're sat at their desks, they're playing the game, you know, 8, 10 hours a day or whatever, and they're really familiar with it. So really, what you really want to do is you want to get people who've not seen it, or maybe people who aren't as familiar, maybe people from another team or something, to have a go on your game. And as difficult it is, just step back and watch them play. Maybe you're watching them like pulling your hair out because they can't find the space bar, but it's really important to see that so that you know what to change next. And obviously people will attack the problems that you present to them in the game in crazy ways, and it will spawn all of these new ideas that you wouldn't have had you not put it in front of someone earlier. So once you've got things working and it's up and running, but it's just not working, it's not feeling right, don't be afraid to chop that idea down. Either go back to the drawing board for that feature, or take a step back and just think, okay, well maybe we should look at this over here to try and see if this solves this problem. Because if you're going to be working from the ground up of something that's just not working, then it's going to ripple out into all of your other features. So how can we better iterate? So iterate more and iterate within the context of the game. And just playtest with people who haven't seen the game. Make sure that you're actually giving it to the end users to make sure that they really giving you useful feedback. And don't be afraid to be bold, because to be honest, we shouldn't be polishing within the early stages. We want to polish within the later stages when it matters, and we're not going to be throwing that stuff out. So iteration is a creative tool. Iterating on stuff, it just gives you perspective. It shows you what is and what isn't working a lot quicker than if you're developing it and then throwing it over the fence, and you're not having to wait to the end to see. And obviously, the quicker that we're turning things around, the more bold that we can be with our ideas. And as I mentioned before, it just creates new problems for which your players will be, trying to do things in a way that you wouldn't expect, and that will then require you to come up with a solution for. So, in conclusion, basically, what I really want to get across with this is that when you're searching for research and references, you should really diversify your palette. Make sure that you're pulling on all of these different sources. Don't just look at games. I mean, sure, do that because it's so important to have a view of the market and a view of what's good and what's bad. But also start to pull on all of these other hobbies and all of these other interests that maybe other people have, and try to learn from them and figure out what makes that tick. Why is that piece of art like that? Or why does this music make me feel that way? How can I elicit that feeling within my medium? And then once we've done that, and you're working on the project, take a step back and realize, what are the limitations of this project? What are my limitations? Okay, I'm not very good at art, so all of my Game Jam games end up with cubes. So that's my limitation, that I have to work within the boundaries, and I'm able to push that because I'm not going to step outside too far away from what I know my limitations are. But then once you've got that problem space, you can start to reframe it by saying, well, maybe what happens if I made a game without any art? Then I actually don't need to work within that problem space. I'm working with that one over here. And then obviously, once you're working on your game, just keep checking it, check it within context, and reiterate and get feedback from obviously yourself and from your other fellow developers, but also from the players who it's going to go out to, so that you can really be pushing your development forward, knowing that you're making the right choices. So just one last thing, we are hiring at Sumo, so if you want to check out the website, by all means do, or if you want to come have a chat, yeah, I'll be around for the rest of the event. But thanks very much for listening, guys.